My coworker took credit for my project in front of our entire department. In the meeting, with my boss present, while I was sitting right next to her, I smiled because 3 weeks earlier, I had emailed the completed project to my boss with a timestamp. Tonight we have 5 stories where someone finally got exactly what they deserved, and every single update will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to where this all started. Story 1 begins. My name is Lauren. I am 34 years old. I live in Seattle, Washington, and 9 months ago I sat in a department meeting and watched my coworker Sandra present a project I had developed over 6 weeks as though it were her own work, and I said nothing, and I smiled, and I let her finish. My coworker's name is Sandra. She is 39, and we had worked in the same department for 3 years. And I had always found her professionally difficult in the specific way of someone who was better at presenting other people's work than producing her own. The project had been assigned to both of us jointly, but the actual development, the research, the framework, the presentation design, had been mine. Sandra had attended 2 of our planning meetings and had been largely absent from the execution. 3 weeks before the departmental presentation, I had completed the project, and, following a practice I had developed after a previous experience with Sandra, had emailed the complete final version to my direct boss with a note saying I was sharing a preview of the completed work. I had done this quietly and without telling Sandra. The presentation meeting came. Sandra stood up and presented. She used the word I threw out. I developed, I researched, I designed. My boss sat at the head of the table. I sat next to Sandra. I said nothing during the presentation. I smiled at the parts that were good, which was most of it, because I had made most of it. When Sandra finished and the room applauded, I raised my hand and said I had one thing to add, and I thanked Sandra for presenting. And then I said that I wanted to make sure everyone knew this had been a joint project, and that for anyone who wanted to see the development timeline, I had shared the completed framework with our boss 3 weeks earlier, which he could confirm. My boss confirmed it immediately. He pulled up the email on his laptop right there and turned the screen so the table could see the timestamp. The room went very quiet in a specific way. Sandra looked at me. I looked at Sandra. I smiled again. The meeting ended shortly after. Sandra did not speak to me for 2 weeks. My boss spoke to me the following morning and said he appreciated the way I had handled it and that he had been watching Sandra's pattern for some time, and that the email had been exactly the kind of documentation that made certain conversations possible. I did not ask what those conversations were. I did not need to. Sandra was moved to a different team 3 months later. I was given the next major project independently. Update. 4 months later, the independent project I was given delivered results that my boss presented to senior leadership last month. My name was on the presentation, my actual name, listed as project lead, on the first slide. I sat in the room while my boss walked through the work, and I thought about a department meeting 9 months ago, and about a timestamp, and about Sandra saying I developed, and about my boss turning his laptop screen so the table could see the senior leadership approved the project for full implementation. My boss sent me a message afterward that said well done. I wrote back thank you and meant it in the simple direct way of someone who has done the work and had it acknowledged, and who does not need anything more than that. Lauren had a timestamp. But in story 2, what someone had was even better. They had a recording they had made without planning to, and when they played it, the room went so quiet. You could hear the air conditioning. Here is what was on it. My name is Marcus. I am 38 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and 11 months ago I sat in my annual performance review and listened to my manager tell me that I had not been considered for the senior position because there was no documentation of any commitment having been made to me about promotion timelines. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my phone on the table between us. I pressed play. My manager's voice came out of the speaker. It was a recording from a meeting 8 months earlier in which my manager had told me, clearly and specifically, that if I delivered on 3 named targets by the end of the year, I would be the first candidate considered for the senior position that was opening. I had delivered on all 3 targets. I had the delivery documentation in a folder in my bag. Illinois is a one-party consent state. I had not planned to record the meeting 8 months earlier. I had been recording a voice note to myself before the meeting began, and had forgotten to stop the recording when my manager had come in and had discovered, when I reviewed it that evening, that the entire conversation had been captured. I had saved it. I had not known I would need it. The review meeting was very quiet for the time it took the recording to play. When it finished, I placed the delivery documentation folder on the table next to the phone. My manager looked at the phone and then at the folder and then at me. I said I wanted to make sure everyone had the full picture. HR was involved by the end of the week. The senior position was offered to me formally the following month with back pay for the period during which I should have been in the role. My manager was required to complete management training. I am in the senior position now. I have a new manager. I still record voice notes before important meetings. I have not forgotten to stop any of them since. Update 3 months later. My former manager left the company last month. I found out through a colleague who mentioned it in passing. I did not feel the satisfaction I thought I might feel when I heard it. What I felt was something closer to tired. The specific tired of someone who spent 11 months on a situation that should have been straightforward, and that required a recording and a folder, and an HR process to resolve. I think about the voice note I forgot to stop sometimes. I think about what would have happened if I had remembered to stop it. Then I stop thinking about it because that particular thought does not go anywhere useful, and I have work to do and the work is mine now in every documented sense. Marcus had a recording he didn't plan to make. But story 3 is about something that was very much planned. Planned over 2 years. By someone who had been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment. And when the moment came, it lasted exactly 4 minutes. Here's what happened in those 4 minutes. My name is Patricia. I am 47 years old. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and 14 months ago I stood up at an HOA annual meeting and presented 40 minutes of documented evidence that resulted in our HOA president being removed from his position, required to repay $12,400 in improperly used community funds, and formally prohibited from holding any position in our HOA for 5 years. It had taken me 2 years to collect everything. My HOA president's name is Frank. He had been president for 6 years when I moved into the community and had built, in those 6 years, the specific kind of local authority that comes from being the person who controls access to the complaint system, the community newsletter, and the vendor selection process simultaneously. What Frank had been doing, what I had documented over 2 years before I said anything, was using his position to direct community maintenance contracts to vendors who provided him with personal benefits, collecting fines from residents that were not being fully deposited into community accounts, and using community funds for expenses that benefited his property specifically rather than the community generally. None of this had been hidden particularly carefully. It had been hidden adequately, which is a different thing. And the difference was what 2 years of careful documentation closed. I had the vendor invoices and the comparative market rates that showed consistent overpayment to Frank's preferred vendors. I had bank statements showing discrepancies between fines collected and fines deposited. That I had 3 specific line items from the community budget that corresponded to improvements made exclusively to Frank's section of the community. I had documented everything through the HOA's own public records, which any resident had the right to access, and which Frank had apparently assumed no resident would request or examine carefully. I had examined them very carefully for 2 years. The annual meeting presentation took 40 minutes. I had arranged with 2 other board members, people I had built relationships with carefully and quietly over the 2 years, to have the floor recognized for me, and to second a motion for a formal audit when the time came. The room contained approximately 80 residents. Frank sat in the front row. I did not look at Frank during the presentation. I looked at the other 79 residents, and I showed them their own community's records, and what those records indicated. The audit motion passed. The audit confirmed everything I had documented, and found additional irregularities I had not. Frank resigned before the results were formally presented. The repayment was a condition of the resignation agreement. I am now on the HOA board. The vendor selection process requires 3 competitive bids. The fine collection process has independent verification. The community newsletter has a new editor, who is not the president. Update: 4 months later. Frank sold his property and moved out of the community last month. Several neighbors told me as though it were news I would find satisfying. I found it neutral. Frank leaving does not change what he did or what the community paid for what he did. And the systems we put in place after the audit do not require Frank's presence or absence to function. What I found more satisfying was the quarterly financial report that our new board published last month. The first one in 6 years that showed every dollar of community funds accounted for with documentation. I read it carefully. It was boring in the best possible way. I think good governance is supposed to be boring, and that the exciting version of it usually means someone is doing something they should not be. Patricia spent 2 years collecting evidence. But in story 4, the evidence collected itself, without anyone planning it, without anyone looking for it. It arrived in a text message, sent to the wrong person, by the person who had the most to lose from it being seen. This is the part that gets me. Here is what the text said. My name is Rebecca. I am 43 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and 2 years ago my sister sent me a text that was meant for her best friend, and that contained information about a plan she and her friend had been developing over several months to influence our elderly parents' will in her favor by systematically limiting my contact with them, and providing our parents with false information about my life and my circumstances designed to make me appear unreliable and irresponsible. My sister's name is Diane. She is 46 and we had always had a complicated relationship in the specific way of sisters, where one has always believed the other was the favorite, and has decided to do something about it. The text described, in detail that I will summarize rather than quote because the specific words are ones I do not need to reproduce, a series of things Diane and her friend had already done, specific conversations they had had with my parents, specific false information they had provided, specific ways they had arranged things so that my calls to my parents happened to coincide with moments when my parents were occupied or unavailable, and things they were planning to do in the coming months. The text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I read it 3 times. Then I screenshotted it. Then I sat for a long time thinking about what to do. I called my parents that evening. Not about the text, just called the regular call we had on Tuesdays. The call felt different knowing what I now knew about what had been being done to shape those calls. I spent a week deciding. Then I drove to my parents' house, a 3-hour drive, and I sat with them and I showed them the text on my phone. My mother read it twice. My father read it once and handed the phone back to me without expression. Then he asked me if I had spoken to Diane. I said I had not. He said he would like to speak to Diane. He called Diane while I was there. I was not in the room for the call. My mother and I sat in the kitchen and she said she had felt something had been different for some time, and had not known what, and that she was sorry she had not asked more questions. I told her she had not known to ask, and that not knowing was not the same as not caring. Diane came to my parents' house the following weekend. I was not present for that visit. What I know is that my parents' estate attorney came to the house the week after Diane's visit, and that my parents made changes to their will that they told me about in broad terms without specifics, and that the broad terms told me enough. Diane and I have not been in direct contact since. My relationship with my parents has been different since the text. More present, more deliberate, less subject to the specific erosion that Diane had been orchestrating. I call on Tuesdays. I visit more than I used to. My parents seem glad when I do. I think they were always glad. I think some things needed to be interrupted before the gladness could be fully received on both sides. Update. 3 months later. My mother called me last month on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, just a Thursday afternoon, because she said she had been thinking about me and wanted to talk. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular: her garden, a book she was reading, a neighbor's new dog. At the end of the call, she said she was glad I had come that day with the text, and that she was sorry some of it had gotten as far as it had before she had known. I told her she had not been responsible for what she had not known. She said she knew but that she was sorry anyway. I said I understood. We said goodbye the way we always say goodbye, and I sat after the call thinking about a Thursday afternoon phone call about a garden, and a book and a neighbor's dog, and about what a Thursday afternoon phone call like that is worth, and thinking that it is worth more than I know how to say. Rebecca's sister sent a text to the wrong person. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about something that was also sent to the wrong person. But this time, it was sent on purpose, to the wrong person, on purpose, by someone who had finally decided that the wrong person was exactly the right one. Here is the last story. My name is Angela. I am 37 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and 8 months ago I told my husband's family, his parents, his 2 brothers and their wives, his aunt, the truth about why my husband and I were not having children. The truth was that we had decided, jointly and deliberately, for years earlier, that we did not want children. My husband's name is Daniel. He had been telling his family for 4 years that we were trying, and that it simply had not happened yet. He had been telling them this without my knowledge for the first year, and with my knowledge, after I discovered what he had been saying, for the 3 years following, during which I had asked him repeatedly to correct the record, and he had repeatedly said he would and had not. I had agreed initially to let him handle it because it was his family, and because I believed him when he said he would tell them. 3 years of him not telling them, and me absorbing the sympathy of people who believed I was struggling with something I was not struggling with, had produced a specific kind of exhaustion that had, by the time of the family gathering 8 months ago, reached its limit. The gathering was a birthday dinner for Daniel's mother. 14 people. I had come to it having made a decision that morning that I had not told Daniel I had made. When Daniel's aunt asked during dinner how things were going with the baby situation and whether we were still trying, I said we were not trying and had not been trying for 4 years, and that we had decided children were not something we wanted, and that I was sorry the family had been given incorrect information, and that I hoped they could understand. The table was quiet. Daniel looked at me. I looked back at Daniel. His mother asked Daniel carefully if that was accurate. Daniel said yes. She asked why he had not told them. He did not have an answer that satisfied anyone at the table, including himself. The dinner continued in a way that was careful and somewhat subdued, and that ended earlier than usual. Daniel and I talked in the car for a long time on the way home. He said I had humiliated him in front of his family. I told him I had told the truth in front of his family after 4 years of asking him to tell it himself, and that the humiliation, if he felt any, was the specific discomfort of a truth that had been delayed rather than anything I had introduced. He was quiet for the rest of the drive. We have been in couples therapy since. The therapy has been honest and difficult, and has addressed things that extend well beyond the children conversation. Patterns in how Daniel handles things he finds difficult to say, and patterns in how I handle being asked to wait for things that are not being said. His family has been, since the dinner, warmer to me in a way that I think comes from knowing something true rather than something false. His mother called me 3 weeks after the dinner and said she hoped I was well and that she was glad to know where things actually stood. I said I was glad she knew. Update: 4 months later. Daniel told his family something else last month, something smaller, about a work situation he had been handling privately rather than mentioning to anyone. He told them at a family dinner, and did not wait until it became something that required a table of 14 people to recalibrate around. His mother looked at him with an expression I recognized as someone receiving something they had been hoping for without being able to ask for it directly. I sat next to Daniel, and I did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. He had said the thing. He had said it while there was still time for the saying to be the whole story, rather than a correction to a longer silence. I thought about couples therapy and about a car ride and about a birthday dinner, and about a smaller thing said in time. And I thought that smaller things said in time are how the larger things eventually get said in time, and that we were, imperfectly and genuinely, working on that.